Colonel Gerald C. Thomas, a G3 officer in the 1st Marine Division, turned as he flipped through the maps laid out in the division operations room and quietly said, "They're coming." Merritt, the commanding officer of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, along with Red Mike Edson, agreed. The question was, from which direction? Edson softly pointed to a ridgeline on an aerial photo, suggesting it looked like a suitable approach. The ridge was marked by 3 hills, forming a narrow landmass that looked like a giant fish. It offered the Japanese ideal cover for a potential assault on Henderson Field, the vital airstrip that had been started by the Japanese and finished by the Marines after their landing on August 7, 1942. The enemy had begun to understand the strategic value of this airfield and were preparing to destroy it along with the Marines defending it by September 9th, just a month after it had been secured. Since capturing a portion of Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division had taken a more defensive posture. But Edson, known for his aggressive leadership, wanted to strike first. With his red hair earning him the nickname Red Mike, Edson had proven his capabilities during campaigns in Nicaragua in the 1920s and 30s. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel B. Griffith, Edson's second-in-command, had known Colonel Thomas from their earlier service in China. Griffith vouched for Edson's abilities as a strategist and tactician. Thomas would soon experience this firsthand, and the two men quickly became friends. Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, had to defend a vast 8,000-yard perimeter from slightly west of Kukum to the Ilu River, with the lines curving 1,500 yards inland on both the east and west flanks. Their main concern was the location of Japanese forces and their next move. Edson, Thomas, and Assistant Division G3 Lieutenant Colt Twining met on September 6th to review plans. Edson proposed a reconnaissance mission to the eastern side of the island to learn more about enemy troop movements and was already setting his sights on Cape Esperance. As Griffith's men returned from a raid on Savo Island, Edson tried to get a message to keep the troops aboard the destroyer transports Little and Gregory. The message didn't reach in time. Edson rushed to the beach to stop the raiders from disembarking, but one company had already landed and the other was about to. He decided to delay the Cape Esperance operation by a day. That decision proved significant. That night, as the 2 APDs were heading toward Lunga Point, Japanese destroyers Udachi, Hatsuyuki, and Murakumo attacked them at dusk. The Japanese fired over 500 shells at the smaller American ships, vastly outgunning them. Many sailors who abandoned ship were killed by the propellers of the enemy vessels. Little suffered 44 wounded and 22 dead. Gregory had 26 wounded and 11 killed. If the 2 raider companies had been aboard, the losses would have been catastrophic. This wasn't the first transport loss. The APD Calhoun had been sunk by enemy aircraft on August 30th, halting much of the Navy's transport operations. Intelligence was still coming in, however. Australian coast watcher Martin Clemens and his indigenous scouts reported a large buildup of Japanese forces near Tasimokco hamlet, estimating 200 to 300 troops. Seeing an opportunity, Edson planned a surprise rear attack on the Japanese by landing the 1st Marine Raider Battalion 3,000 yards east of the settlement, supported by the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion. Though Vandergrift was cautious, he approved the operation. On the morning of September 8th, the APDs McKean and Manley, along with 2 small patrol boats called Yippies, arrived at Typhoon Point. Just as the Marines were boarding their Higgins boats, a stroke of luck occurred. A U.S. convoy of 5 destroyers and cargo ships appeared on the horizon, heading west toward Lunga Point. The Japanese defenders mistakenly believed this was the start of a massive attack and fled into the jungle. The Marines landed without resistance. After securing the beach, the riflemen began advancing toward Tasimokco. The raiders moved cautiously and discovered Japanese supplies and two unmanned 37mm anti-tank guns from the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Company. The presence of this equipment confirmed that enemy forces were nearby and larger than expected. Clemens's reports were spot on. Edson called in airstrikes from the Cactus Air Force at Henderson Field and informed Vandergrift that he had landed behind a major Japanese force. Despite orders to pull back, he chose to press on. Around 8 a.m., the raiders crossed the Koli River and exchanged fire with enemy troops on the far bank. Japanese forces responded with 75mm artillery before fleeing and leaving the gun behind. Edson's plan to encircle Tasimokco from the south was halted by deep river water and swampy ground, so he adjusted his approach. As Major Lloyd Nickerson's Company B spotted Japanese soldiers marching eastward, they moved into a narrow corridor. Fearing an ambush, Edson sent a patrol from Company A to outflank the enemy. Advancing toward Tasimokco, they discovered more medical supplies, dugouts, and defensive trenches. They also found life preservers, food supplies, and backpacks, indicating the presence of a significant enemy force. Convinced that a major Japanese unit was near, Edson prepared for one of the most critical moments in the Guadalcanal campaign. The assault on the village was led by Company B's 1st Platoon under Captain John Sweeney. Shells from a 75mm artillery piece suddenly exploded in the treetops. Captain Rex Crockett's 2nd Platoon was struck by white-hot shrapnel, killing one Marine and severing another's limb. Sweeney's infantrymen responded quickly and killed the enemy operating the gun. The Marines pressed on and encountered a machine gun nest. 3 raiders outflanked the position and swiftly silenced it, while Sweeney mockingly shouted "Baka," meaning "you fool" in Japanese. The Marines needed more firepower to drive the enemy from their positions, as their 60mm mortars were the heaviest weapons they carried. Edson requested additional air support. American Curtiss P-40s under Captain Dale Brandon from the 67th Fighter Squadron soon flew overhead. Reinforcements from the Parachute Battalion, known as the Chutes, and Company E of the Raiders arrived shortly before noon. Edson ordered his troops to destroy enemy supplies and weapons, ignoring instructions to withdraw. They set fire to a radio generator, rice, and canned goods. Gun breeches were removed and thrown into the water, and important documents were collected. By late afternoon, the Marines reboarded their ships, many carrying food cans and bottles of sake. Black smoke from the fires was visible for kilometers. The Tasimokco raid was a major success. The Marines gathered vital intelligence at the cost of 2 dead and 6 wounded. 27 Japanese were killed, their bodies counted. Along with securing critical documents, the operation boosted troop morale. Marine Raider Frank Guidoni later said their morale was sky high. Edson reported back to division headquarters and informed General Vandergrift that this was not just a random group of Japanese. He was convinced a major enemy assault was coming. The division's only Japanese language specialist, Captain Sherwood Pappy Moran, agreed after reviewing the captured documents. Emerging from his dark intelligence shack, Moran informed Thomas and Edson that the enemy was preparing for an attack. They believed the ridge chosen by Edson would be the likely target. In his account of the campaign, Marine historian Major John L. Zimmerman described the ridge as dominating the surrounding terrain and linked by a narrow road. The area was encircled by jungle-covered ravines. A deep lagoon lay west of the ridge's southern end, and 4 spurs projected from the ridge, 2 on each side. The highest point, Hill 123, stood near the center and offered a view of Henderson Field. Hill 80 was about 600 yards south, surrounded by jungle, and a smaller mound to the north overlooked the approach to Henderson. On September 10th, 840 Marines and paratroopers moved toward the ridge. Edson joked they were heading to a quieter spot due to the beach area being too dangerous from bombing. They set up camp along a 900-yard line stretching from the Lunga River to Hill 80. The raiders took the southern hill, and the parachutists held the left flank. Despite weeks of fighting on Guadalcanal and reduced company sizes, the Marines knew the importance of holding the ridge. If the Japanese took it and the airfield, the campaign could be lost. Raider Guidoni recalled that even the lowest-ranking soldiers understood the gravity of the situation. If overrun, they would be forced into guerrilla warfare in the jungle. Edson made the best use of the terrain. He didn't simply place his men atop the ridge, as that would have left the flanks exposed, nor did he dig in at the front, which would have allowed the enemy to find and exploit weak points. Instead, they began fortifying their positions. Machetes and entrenching tools echoed through the jungle as foxholes were dug under the intense sun. Barbed wire obstacles were set up. Patrols moved deeper into the jungle. One raider jokingly called his foxhole his rest area. Colonel Thomas ordered the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, to create reserve positions between the airstrip and the ridge. Forward observers and artillery, including Colonel Pedro's howitzers, were coordinated with Edson. Marines from the 1st Pioneer and 1st Amphibious Tractor Battalions formed a defensive line west of the Lunga River, with a dense jungle acting as a barrier to the east. General Vandegrift decided to move the division command post despite Edson's protest. Vandegrift remained focused on a coastal attack and underestimated the inland threat. Edson was determined to prove him wrong. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces approached. The Kawaguchi detachment, led by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, advanced toward the ridge. Kawaguchi was a seasoned and respected leader with a stern appearance and strong build. His force, centered on the 124th Infantry Regiment, included troops in excellent condition, many of whom had worked in coal mines. The detachment included anti-tank units, artillery, and machine gun companies, totaling over 4,000 soldiers. On September 8th, Kawaguchi heard gunfire from Tew Point as his troops prepared to move on Henderson Field. Upon learning of the American raid on Tasimokco, he considered diverting to retaliate. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary about the frustration of such daring attacks. Other Japanese leaders shared his anger and wanted Kawaguchi to punish the Americans. However, Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto of the 17th Area Army convinced his superiors to let Kawaguchi continue with his original mission, knowing how hard it was to redirect the determined general. Although allowed to proceed, Kawaguchi's plan to take Henderson Field was flawed. The Marines, though unsure of the exact attack direction, were now alerted thanks to the raid. Edson was gambling that the ridgeline would be the strongest point of defense. The United States had some success in disrupting nightly supply missions by the Japanese, known as the Tokyo Express. American ships managed to intercept some of the enemy convoys, either destroying them or forcing them to reroute. This persistence delayed the Japanese attack, as one of Kawaguchi's battalions had to land west of the radar and parachute barrier. Every Japanese soldier then had to navigate treacherous jungle terrain to reach the Marine lines. As Kawaguchi had feared, his units struggled through the thick undergrowth and couldn't reach their positions in time for the planned attack on the 12th. The usually composed leader was frustrated by the lack of contact with his scattered battalions. He later confessed he had never felt so helpless, as his brigade was dispersed and completely out of control. His grand plan to launch a coordinated assault was disintegrating into scattered and chaotic attempts. Marine historian John Hoffman, in Once a Legend, noted that Kawaguchi's complicated strategy might have been understandable. He believed he was attacking through undefended areas, hoping to catch the Americans off guard in terrain that seemed unsuitable for defense. Kawaguchi's strategy involved one group of about 1,500 soldiers launching a direct attack on the Marines, while 2,500 others would advance along the ridge and breach the perimeter to overrun the airstrip. The stage was set for a major battle that would determine the fate of the American position on Guadalcanal. Platoon Sergeant Joe Bunton from Company A was ordered to lead a 25-man patrol into the jungle along the Lunga River on the morning of September 11th to locate the advancing Japanese. As the patrol moved silently, they began to hear Japanese voices just before noon. Then the shooting started. Bullets tore through the humid air as a fierce skirmish erupted. The Marines held their positions, waiting for the next move. Suddenly, the roar of Japanese Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers filled the air. Explosions thundered around them. One bomb landed near Bunton and PFC Sylvester, his Browning automatic rifleman. They were thrown by the blast and buried in debris. Bunton turned to check on Sylvester, who was silently praying, clutching a rosary. Though terrifying, the bombing run inadvertently benefited the Americans as it disrupted the Japanese attack. Bunton's patrol pulled back, only to find their camp in ruins. Tents and structures were destroyed. 10 Marines were wounded, and 2 were dead. One of them, Sergeant Harold Floater, had decided to go on the patrol after winning a coin toss. He died from the concussion of a bomb while leaning against a banyan tree. That night, on September 12th, rain began to fall. At 10 p.m., Japanese destroyers and a cruiser opened fire on the ridge, but most of the shells landed harmlessly beyond the Marines' positions. About 20 minutes later, Japanese flares lit up the sky. The Marines readied themselves. Edson had accurately predicted the timing of the enemy's assault. The first wave came from the 124th Infantry under Major Yuki Chikokusho. They attacked near Company C, yelling to provoke return fire and expose Marine positions. But the Marines stayed quiet, having learned from past encounters. However, on the left flank, the Japanese broke through between 2 Marine platoons. One platoon was forced to fall back and link up with Company B on Hill 80. The second platoon was overrun, despite hundreds of rounds from a machine gun. The attackers showed no mercy, hacking survivors with bayonets and swords. On the right, Japanese troops swam across the Lunga River, trying to encircle Company C. Orders to retreat were sent out, but not everyone got them. Machine gunners from Company C and E waited until the enemy was close before opening fire. The Japanese advance was slowed by grenades and relentless rifle fire. All night, the Marines were haunted by the cries of comrades being tortured. One young Marine asked a World War I veteran if Europe had been this bad. The veteran simply replied that this was the worst he'd ever seen. As dawn approached, the Japanese offensive stalled. Even though they pushed Charlie Company back, the 5th Marines Reserve Battalion blocked further progress. At sunrise on September 13th, P-40s and F-4F Wildcats strafed and bombed the Japanese positions. Mortars and howitzers from the 11th Marines added to the barrage. Kawaguchi's radio was destroyed by shrapnel, cutting him off from headquarters. Desperate, he tried to regroup his forces for another attack on Henderson Field. Meanwhile, Edson prepared to retake Company C's lost ground. He organized a counterattack, but it failed. That morning, he gathered his commanders, ate cold hash from a can, and issued instructions. He reminded them that the enemy would return and told them to prepare. Get the wire line set, dig in, and get some rest. At around 7 p.m., Kawaguchi launched another assault. His exhausted troops attacked Company B's positions on open terrain. The Marines, weakened by illness and injuries, managed to regroup with Company C. Kawaguchi failed to exploit the opening he had made. As Edson considered sending reinforcements to that part of the line, another Japanese battalion launched a fierce assault on the center of his defenses. A gap quickly opened in the Marine line. The parachutists of Charlie and Baker companies were forced to fall back. On Hill 123, their commander, Captain Harry B. Torerson, tried to reorganize them. As a result of the withdrawal, Company B of the Raiders became isolated. To protect his struggling Marines, Edson called in artillery fire closer to their position and kept in close contact with his forward observers. According to Brigadier General Samuel B. Griffith in his book, The Battle for Guadalcanal, some Japanese soldiers jumped into Marine foxholes to avoid being encircled, only to be taken down in brutal close combat. 8 corpsmen and 1 doctor, Lieutenant Edward P. McClary, were recognized with a staggering 9 Navy crosses for their extraordinary bravery while treating the wounded under heavy fire. Severely injured Marines, some with limbs torn off, shattered legs, or pierced chests, were dragged to a rough dressing station where 2 Navy doctors worked to clean and bandage wounds. A sudden alarm of a gas attack sparked panic among some Marines, causing them to begin retreating. Major Ken Bailey, who led Company C of the Raiders and also managed supplies by himself during the battle, stopped the retreat. He shouted that it was a trick and there was no gas, urging the men to return to their positions. His presence on the battlefield was inspiring. Known as a Marine's Marine, Bailey seemed to be everywhere during the fight. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his courage, but tragically was killed by machine gun fire at Matonic Harbor about a week later. The medal was awarded posthumously. Another key figure was Red Mike Edson, who was described by a former Raider as more terrifying than the enemy. According to historian Michael S. Smith in his book, Ridge, The Battle That Saved Guadalcanal, Edson led the defense with composure, even while bullets tore through his shirt. He knew the battle's importance. Henderson Field was just a mile away. During a critical moment, he was heard shouting that it didn't matter who the men were, raiders, parachutists, engineers, or artillerymen. They were all Marines and had to rise and fight. By midnight, Company B had reached a relatively safer position. The raiders and parachutists formed a defensive line in a horseshoe shape. The 105mm guns under Don Pedro del Valle continued firing, sometimes within 200 yards of the Marines. At around 2 a.m., red flares lit the sky, signaling another enemy attack. The Japanese launched a new assault with screams of "Banzai" piercing the air. Torerson's men held the left flank fiercely. One Marine recalled that killing 2 enemy soldiers often resulted in 6 more appearing. Some enemy troops were shot multiple times before going down, and one even crawled forward clutching his own intestines to reach the Marine line before dying. Communication lines to the division command post were severed as Japanese mortar fire pounded both flanks. A forward observer rushed back to the 11th Marines Fire Direction Center and ordered the artillery to blanket the ridge. The 5th Battalion's guns delivered devastating fire, sweeping from side to side across the enemy's path. The Japanese attackers were torn apart. Once the assault was repelled, Edson ordered Charlie and Baker companies to rejoin Able Company. The parachutists advanced slowly, throwing grenades and firing submachine guns, restoring their line and linking up with fellow Marines. By 4 a.m., Edson's men were near exhaustion. He radioed for reinforcements, and soon the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines began to relieve the raiders and parachutists. Though dawn approached, scattered resistance remained. Captain Dale Brandon's U.S. Army Air Corps pilots launched strafing runs on the surrounding jungle, mowing down fleeing enemies with machine guns and 20mm cannons. Kawaguchi's remaining forces were forced to withdraw. Samuel Griffith described the scene as a ridge soaked in blood and littered with bodies. Nearly 500 Japanese troops were killed in grotesque poses of sudden, violent death, their lifeless eyes staring toward the rising sun. On September 14th, Edson's Marines left the ridge for a much-needed rest at Kukum, but their victory came at a steep cost. The 1st Raider Battalion lost 135 men, while the 1st Parachute Battalion lost another 128. A total of 59 Marines were confirmed dead or missing. Of the 377 para-Marines who had landed on August 7th, only 86 remained. Out of the 750 raiders who came ashore, 234 were either killed, wounded, or missing. On September 18th, The raiders remained on Guadalcanal as the parachutists were evacuated after their heavy losses. Meanwhile, Kawaguchi's retreating troops faced a punishing journey through the jungle. With most of their food gone, they had to cross the Lunga River and navigate rugged terrain near Mount Austin. They survived by drinking stagnant water and eating tree bark, weeds, and beetle nuts. First, they abandoned heavy weapons, then their lighter gear. Many of the wounded succumbed during the march, their open wounds infected with maggots. The once proud Kawaguchi detachment reached the area around Point Cruz in shambles, reduced to a demoralized, ragged unit. The battle for the ridge produced many heroes, but one man stood out above the rest, Colonel Red Mike Edson. His foresight in predicting the enemy's main point of attack on Henderson Field proved critical. Marine historian John Hoffman noted that Edson's tactical instinct ensured his men were in the right place at the right time. He carefully analyzed available intelligence and persuaded higher command to act. He maximized his small force and used the terrain to compensate for disadvantages. His decisions on troop deployment and firepower were effective and timely. Even more significantly, the battle shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. One Japanese general later admitted that the Imperial Army had underestimated the tenacity of the Marines, who were a far more determined enemy than the Chinese they had previously fought. In recognition of his leadership, Edson was nominated by General Vandegrift for the Medal of Honor. The battlefield would come to be known simply as the Ridge, or more commonly, Edson's Ridge, honoring the man whose leadership turned the tide. Either name is equally fitting to the Marines who fought and survived that brutal confrontation.